All right. So is there something you'd like to ask about? Yes, sir.
How many people in the Bible have not felt
Enoch and Elijah. Enoch was translated. God took him. The cool thing is during Passover, the Jews always left a cup of wine outside in case Elijah came through for Passover. And so if you're the town drunk, you just walk down the street, go to everybody's porch. It's like trick-or-treating for the alcoholics. It was really cool. But so they were always messed up that Elijah didn't have a body or a grave. And so they were always worried about it, And every time somebody showed up, it was like, Elijah came back. Elijah came back. Well, he didn't. Okay. Well, he didn't on the Mount of Transfiguration. But anyway, all right. Walked with God and was no more. Right? Yeah. That's pretty cool. Translated. So you skip the middle, which is cool. Great question. Any other questions? Okay. Oh, wow. Okay. Well, now, I was familiar with Andrew Kaiser and Allison Kaiser had in North Carolina was doing kind of a Spanish ministry. They spent a lot of time in Peru, and I think they're moving back to Texas to do that. And then I've got a missionary friend who's at International Bible College at Heritage Christian University named Eugene, who moved here from the Ukraine. I know it's a big area, but he's a missionary from Ukraine who's here to study. So I know some Ukrainian Christians as well. And Slava Savkovsky teaches in the Ukraine somewhere, and he was a student at Alabama A&M and was at our church for a while. So I've got a few Ukrainian connections. Cool. All right, other questions? Yes, sir. The Passover was a celebration where God told the Israelites that I'm going to do a final miracle, a final plague, and Pharaoh will let you go. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to send something, depending on how you read it. Psalm 78 will talk about all of the plagues of Israel. And then it'll say, and God sent among them a marauding band of angels. Now, I don't know if that's a phrase that summarizes all the plagues, or if it's a phrase at the last plague. But God said, on this night, the 14th night of the month of Nisan, the Jewish calendar, not ours, I'm going to kill everything in Egypt that's the firstborn. If it's the firstborn horse, if it's the firstborn pig, if it's the firstborn daughter, if it's a firstborn son, everything that's the firstborn in this family will die. If you don't want the firstborn in your house to die, you take a lamb at evening and you kill it and you roast it. You eat no leaven in your bread and you eat this lamb dressed to travel, and you take the blood of the lamb and you put it on the lintel on the doorpost. And when I come into Egypt, every house that has blood on the door, I will pass over and not kill the firstborn. And every house that doesn't, there'll be a death. And as soon as that happened, Pharaoh asked the children of Israel to leave town. And so that's what made the children of Israel go free. And they celebrated every year in Israel as a celebration of God freeing them from Egyptian bondage. And that's Passover. And they still celebrate it today, the Jewish people do. Great question. Anybody else? All right, so let's look at 1 Thessalonians. If you come up with something else, you can ask me, but let's look at this. 1 Thessalonians chapter 4. Verse 3. For this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God. So we'll stop there. He said, okay, this is God's will. This is what God wants out of you. Okay? So it's like if you get a job And when you get the job, you may get a job description. Hey, well, I'm going to hire you to work for my landscape company. Is it important to know if you're going to be riding the zero-turn mower or running the weed eater? You want a what job description, right? Okay, I'm gonna do this job. You guys don't remember the old Wild Kingdom show that came on? This guy, Mutual of Omaha, was an insurance company, and they sponsored this show where these guys would go out into the wilderness and study lions or wildebeest or whatever. Well, there's a guy named Marlin Perkins, who was the older guy, and he's kind of the host of the show. And they had a guy named Stan Bronk, and he was this young, strapping guy. Well, it seemed like in every episode, we're going to have to wrestle the lion and put a tranquilizer dart in him. We'll sit in the truck while Stan does this. Stan should have read the job description because he was always out, wrestling the python or the anaconda, and the older guy was always sitting in the truck. It was comedy gold. Well, here's your job description. For this is the will of God. This is what God wants you to do. Your sanctification. Now, what does sanctification mean? Set apart. This is God's will for you. He wants you to live in a way that your life is set apart for Him. It's almost like the idea that you're reserved for a special purpose. So this is the will of God, your sanctification. Now, what does sanctification involve? Well, it involves lots of things. But one of the main things it involves, this is the will of God, your sanctification, that you should abstain from sexual immorality. Now, what does the word sexual immorality mean? Okay, it's a Greek word, fornication. It's an English word, fornication, from the Greek word porneia, and it's like a big, broad umbrella. It's anything that is immoral or wrong that involves your sexuality. And so it's not just one type of sexual immorality. It's anything that you do sexually that is immoral or out of bounds or trespassing or whatever. Okay? So God's will for us as men, God's will for us as young men, is that we understand the job description that God wants us set apart. Part of us being set apart is that we're not going to be participants in sexual immorality. And he gives a little better description, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor. So when he uses this term, possess his own vessel, it's a real interesting word. It's a chariot racing term. And so, these guys would get in these chariots. It's a little buggy with two wheels, dragged by horses. If you want to know how wide a chariot was, a Roman chariot, the wheels were as wide as a railroad track. Because our modern railroad tracks were based on the width of a Roman chariot, by the way. That's a fun fact. Now, what happens if you're racing in a chariot and you get out of your lane? You get in the other guy's lane. And you get hit, you get crashed. Basically, they were asking me for my lesson title. I said, sometimes I title this lesson, Stay in Your Lane, Bro. Okay? This is God's will for you, your sanctification. Now, what does that mean? That you learn to possess your vessel. That you keep your vehicle in its lane. You don't get out of bounds. You don't drift into this lane. When you've got to possess your vessel with sanctification and honor. So when it comes to your sexuality, when it comes to what you do, how you think, what you look at, pictures you take, pictures you send, pictures you see, all those things involve whether or not you're possessing your vessel with sanctification, the idea I'm set apart for God, and whether or not you do this with honor. Now, what does sanctification honor look like? Well, here's what it doesn't look like. This is God's will for you, that you should abstain from sexual immorality, that each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who don't know God. He said, when you start talking about how you should live as a Christian man, and you start talking about what am I going to do with the fact that I'm a sexual creature, you're going to possess your vessel. I'm going to keep it in control. I'm going to stay in my lane. I'm going to do a sanctification and honor. Well, what's the opposite of sanctification and honor? In passionate lust like the Gentiles. Now, what does passionate lust mean? Are your emotions information or instruction? Information. A person who only follows his passions uses them as instruction. I think this is interesting. I'm going to look at it. I think she's beautiful. I'm going to touch her. I think, and it's, do you let your passions control you, or do you control your passions? Does that make sense? Now, when we talk about emotional control or passionate control, emotional control doesn't mean you don't have emotions. And we've taught that wrongly for a long time. You know, hey, you can't get mad. You're a Christian. No, you can get mad. You got to decide whether mad drives the bus or whether you drive the bus. Courage. What does it mean to be courageous? Well, that guy's not afraid of anything. If you're not afraid of something, if you're not afraid of anything, you're not very smart. Okay? If you've never been afraid, you haven't been outside much. The world's a scary place. It's a contact sport. Courage is not being afraid. Courage is when I am afraid, I do the right thing even though fear is present. Controlling my anger doesn't mean I never get angry. Controlling my anger means that when I'm angry, I don't let it lead me into destruction. I don't let it lead me into hurting people. I don't let it lead me into saying things. The same thing is, hey, it's okay as a young man to have passion. It's okay to be interested in girls. You know, right now in today's modern society, if somebody says, hey, I caught my son looking at stuff. Is he looking at, you know, girls? Yes, praise God. Okay, I'm just glad they're interested in girls these days. You're designed to be interested in girls, but it's that passion has a place when you're married. But before you're married, if you just say, hey, I'm a young man and I'm going to date all the girls and I'm going to have all the sex I can have, or I'm going to do all kind of, that's letting your passions run. He says, look, you possess your vessel with sanctification and honor, not like the Gentiles who run in passion of lust. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean you act a certain way. It doesn't mean you deny your feelings. Look, I've got this feeling. Now what am I going to do with it? And so when somebody says, well, I've got this feeling, well, we all have feelings. My default setting, I don't know, the way I came from the factory, my default setting is confrontation. Now, I wish I was kinder and gentler. I try to be kinder and gentler. I try to listen to people. I try to attune to them. I try to see the world from their perspective. But when push comes to shove, my typical answer is, here's a glass to get over it. Here's a straw to suck it up. I just, you know, and I can solve a problem with force. Always been able to do that. You know, a guy starts acting up in a restaurant and he's causing a problem. He's scaring people. You can ask him to leave nicely. You can put him to sleep and drag him out. I'd much rather do that. But I shouldn't always do that. There's a time for talk. There's a time for discussion. There's a time for, hey, wonder why he's scared. Wonder why he's acting that way. Well, just because you have a certain feeling doesn't mean you let that feeling control you. So you possess your vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles. Now, when he says Gentiles, what he's saying is, this is the way you lived before you were a Christian. Now, you just think about what the rules are at your school about how guys and girls interact. And then think about what your rules are as a Christian about how guys and girls interact. Look at what the guys at your school would look at on their phones or share versus what a Christian should look at or share. You don't live by those rules. These are not your rules of engagement. This is not the way you come. So this is God's will for you, that you be sanctified and you learn how to possess your vessel. You drive this vehicle. The things in this vehicle, the hungers, and I don't just mean for pizza, the things that your body's hungry for, you don't let those cravings control your vehicle. Now, keep reading with this. You possess your vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles, that no one should take advantage of and defraud his brother in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we have forewarned and as we testified. Paul says, listen, when you're driving this vessel and you get into somebody else's lane, whether you lead your brother into some kind of temptation, hey man, look at this picture. Hey man, this girl sent me this picture. or whether you're out with a girl and you go, hey, we need to go do this. He says, you cannot defraud or take advantage of one another. Now, what does defraud or take advantage mean? What does it mean to defraud somebody? You know what a fraud lawsuit is? Yeah, you steal something. Or take advantage of something. I recognize that there's a weakness, and I use this weakness in you, and I exploit it. Defrauding somebody is like tricking them into something. Okay, there's an old trick game here. All right. How many coins do I have between my fingers? Okay, how many coins do I have between my fingers? It's pretty obvious. How many coins do I have in my fingers? Okay, I say I've got 3. If I'm wrong, will you buy my lunch? Now, we're really not going to bet or gamble. Okay? But we'll just, for the sake of an exercise, okay? How many coins do you see? Okay, I say I've got 3. If I'm wrong, will you buy my lunch? Sure, okay, I'm wrong. Buy my lunch. Everybody get that? If I'm wrong, well, guess what? I'm wrong. There's only 2 there. Okay, that's defrauding somebody. I'm tricking you into something. Now, the magic trick part goes like this. Okay, but it's over here. All right. And so what happens, he says, when you do, calm down. Nothing really happened there. Okay. So what happens when I get with my Christian friends and I go, no, this is okay. This is a movie that's okay to watch. This is a thing we can look at. Or I get with a girl and I say, hey, let's do this. God says when you treat people in a way that causes them to get their chariot out of control, or you violate the sanctification honor, you've defrauded them, you've cheated them, and you've taken advantage of them. And you can't do that. As a young man, your job when you're with a young lady is to protect her. Physically, spiritually, psychologically, emotionally, and sexually. That's your job. Now, it becomes defrauding when she thinks she can trust you and you lead her into temptation. It becomes defrauding when, as a dad, I trusted you to go out with her and you treat her this way. See, when my daughter was little and she wanted to go get a hamburger, guess who took her? Guess who drove? Guess who paid? Guess who handled any fool that messed with her? Okay. Now, when you say, "Hey, Mr. Jones, I'd like to borrow your daughter for an evening," what you're telling me is I'm going to drive, I'm going to pay, and I'm going to protect. And that means protecting her from you and protecting her from herself. And as a dad, when I trust you to do that, if you lie to me or you cheat me, there's a problem there. Okay? Maybe not, The interesting thing about this, and I like, I teased a lot about, boys and my... No one should take advantage of or defraud his brother and sister in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all. You know what? When I sat down and talked to a young man about whether he defrauds or not my daughter, I'm the least of his worries. One of the few passages in the Old Testament, or in the New Testament, where Paul talks about what God will do to you rather than what God has done for you. Almost all of Paul's arguments is, look what God has done for you. In this case, Paul says, look, if you mess with each other and you defraud them sexually, God's the avenger of that. If I come to your house and say, hey, I got a problem with the way you treat my daughter, you get off light. If God comes to your house and says, hey, you take one of my daughters out, you did this with her. You led her down to this path. Dude, that's a serious verse right there. God is the avenger of all such. Me being an intimidating dad, that's the least of your worries. Okay? In fact, that's a walk in the park compared to God said, hey, you took one of my special creations and you cheated her, you defrauded her. Basically, God said to me, Jones, stand down, I'll handle this one. Wow, that's scary. That's super scary to me. So your job as a young man is you be the purity leader and the spiritual leader in your relationship with these young ladies. Now, what happens in our society is you've got access to things that I never had access to as a young man. There's 800 million pornographic internet sites. And a lot of them are free. But the problem is, it's like any other kind of drug, it has a law of diminishing returns. So if scantily clad people turns you on, you look at enough scantily clad people, it doesn't work anymore. You got to see naked people. And naked people eventually going to quit working. You got to see videos. And then videos quit working, you got to go see them live. And then watching them doesn't work, you got to be with somebody. Because the part of your brain that rewards you for pleasure is it gives you a shot of a chemical called dopamine. And dopamine, anytime you like anything, you get a shot of dopamine. You eat chocolate, dopamine. You eat pizza, dopamine. You go surfing, dopamine. You swing on a rope, dopamine. You look at a picture of pornography, dopamine. Now, the interesting thing is you got this mechanism in your brain that's called the seeking mechanism. And you get a hit of dopamine every time you do something different. That's why you can spend hours looking for something else on TV. Because every time you change the channel, you go, oh, that's new, oh, that's new, oh, that's new, oh, that's new. Well, the same thing happens when you look at DSL, internet pornography. How many times can you change a screen in a minute? Well, as many times as you can change a screen in a minute by clicking it sideways, you get a shot of dopamine. That's why we spend hours just looking at something different on Facebook. Now, you add to that the thing I'm looking at different is not Facebook, but it's pornography. You're getting addicted to that dopamine rush. And then you can't put it down. You can't live without it. And then the crazy thing happens is you're wiring your brain to say, this is what sex looks like. This is what sex sounds like. This is what I should expect. When expectation doesn't meet reality, you end up with depression. Because when life doesn't turn out like I expect it to, I suffer loss, and humans grieve all losses. I'm driving down the interstate, going home. Got 8 hours to drive. Somewhere around 2:30 Sunday afternoon, as I'm driving home, I'm going to say, I'm hungry. And it happens to me every time. I see a sign that says Wendy's chicken sandwich. And that chicken sandwich on that billboard. Son, is that not... I've never seen that chicken sandwich. Ever. Man, I'm going to get me one of those. I drive in on that chicken sandwich. It looks like they killed Tweety Bird and deep fried him. If you ever find the real chicken sandwich from Wendy's, call me. I'll fly anywhere in the world to eat that thing because I've been looking for one all my life. But I go and I go, here's your chicken sandwich, and there's more bread than there's bird. This is terrible. I have a terrible lunch. Think about being married and being allowed to have sex anytime you want to and going, I really don't want that. You just defrauded your wife because she saved herself from sexual purity so she could have a sexual partner and enjoy what God designed for married people to enjoy. And now you've defrauded her because you said, this is what I expect, and you're not going to do that. And by the way, a little girl that grew up and is not a professional model and hadn't been enhanced by an airbrush in a magazine or on an internet site, she can't compete with those images. Well, this is what naked people look like. Real naked people don't look like that. That's it. Everything you see on a camera is shot with a perfect angle at the perfect tide from a perfect distance. And real life things can't compete with that. Anytime you compete fantasy with reality, fantasy wins. But the problem is fantasy is not real, it's fantasy. And so if you're not careful and you don't possess your vessel with sanctification and honor, you're setting yourself up to be married to a real live human you're allowed to have sex with and not be interested in it. Or be disappointed in it. Or hate it. And the chances of you doing that to a place where it leads you to cheating on your wife with images or cheating on your wife with other people, a pretty high category for that. Now, there's a balance for sexual purity. Again, you're okay to have passion. You just can't chase those passions and lust like the Gentiles do. Be super, super careful with that. But if you don't behave and you lead people or you lead yourself or you look at these things, then when fantasy competes with reality, fantasy wins, and you're setting yourself up to be defrauded. Not only did you defraud your spouse, but you cheated yourself because you built up this premature sexualization. You've had experience with sexual things that you weren't premature. You weren't mature enough to handle it. And you've ruined your thought process. You begin to see girls as objects. not as people. You begin to see girls as, this is something I use just like I do food to satisfy a craving. And that's not what sex is about. Sex is about intimacy. And God says you have intimacy, connection, before you have sex. And if you have sex in order to create the intimacy, you're getting the product without the process. Now, you know what that is, right? I had a little teenage girl in my office and had a really bad relationship with her dad, and she needed male attention. Well, she figured out about the age of 14 that males will give you attention. If you dress a certain way, you act a certain way, you give them access to certain things on your body. So she was having multiple sexual encounters as a young teenage girl in order to fill this gap in her life. And I was trying to tell her, well, you're getting this, it feels like intimacy, but it's really not, because you're getting the product without doing the process. And that's cheating, right? It turned out she liked to bass fish, which is really cool. And I said, would you like to have a trophy bass mounted on your wall? She says, yes, I would. I said, well, take that one. I've got an 8-pounder in my office. She goes, I don't want that one. I said, why not? She said, I didn't catch it. Product without process. When you have sex before you're married, you're getting the product without the process. And not only are you cheating the person you're with, you're cheating yourself as well. And internet pornography addiction is damaging and deadly. Now, the terrible thing, and you're 16 and your girlfriend's 16 and she sends you a picture of her and she's naked and you keep it on your phone. When you turn 21 and you got a picture of her when she was 16, that's child pornography. You go to federal prison. And the things you have on your phone don't go away. They don't disappear. They don't die. And so you're setting yourself up to ruin the rest of your life if you're not super, super careful. And you don't understand that the things you put on the internet never, ever, ever go away. And if you're not careful, you get pulled into these things, and the addictive power of pornography ruins a lot of people's lives. And so here's God's will for you, that you learn to possess your vessel with sanctification and honor, and you should abstain from sexual immorality. Each of you should know how to possess his own vessel in sanctification and honor, not in passion of lust like the Gentiles who do not know God, that no one should take advantage of. You're not leading somebody in who's got less experience than you, and you should not defraud your brother or your sister in this matter, because the Lord is the avenger of all such, as we have been forewarned to you and also testify. Because God did not call us to uncleanness, but to holiness. And whoever rejects this does not reject man, but God, who has given us his Holy Spirit. Folks, that is probably the strongest warning about sexual purity that there is in the Scripture. And you've got to be super, super careful with what you put into your mind. Because the pictures you see in your mind are the pictures you're going to want to act out in your life. And if you fill yourself with the wrong pictures, your actual fulfillment in life will be empty. You'll be depressed. You'll be anxious. You'll be sad. And you won't. And in fact, you'll end up ruining your sex life. And you'll end up ruining your spiritual life as well. Now, that's a deep, heavy subject, but I'm going to stop and ask, are there any questions or comments or things you'd like to add to that? Okay, anybody know what the law of diminishing returns is? Okay, the law of diminishing return says that at some point, once you've experienced something at this level, you're never happy till you go back to that level. So it's diminishing return. It's like skiing and then learning to snowboard and then going back to skis. Wonk, wonk. You can't do the cool stuff on skis you can do on a snowboard. Okay? And once you've been on a snowboard, you throw your skis away. All right? Just like if you ever water skied and then you learn to barefoot. Once you barefoot water skied, skiing is no fun anymore. You get on top of that water and just rock and roll. It's like doing taekwondo and then learning jiu-jitsu. You're not going to go back to that business, okay? All right? And so there's this thing, and there's a book. It's actually called The Emotional Hand Grenade Stepladder, which is a weird title for a book. But it shows this ladder, and every rung on the ladder is something on the physical connection scale. Holding hands, hugging, lingering hugging, kissing, deep kissing, touching people with their clothes on, touching people with their clothes off. And once you've stepped on the rung of that ladder, you're never satisfied with a lower rung on the ladder. And so the more sexual experience you have, the further up the ladder you go every time you go on a date. And if you and a girl have been dating and you went to rung 3, every time you go out, you're going to want to go to at least a rung 3. It only takes once. And then your body says, hey, I know what this feels like. This is how it's supposed to work. Because your body likes to repeat cycles. Your body likes to repeat patterns. Okay? So if you do anything that's enjoyable and your body doesn't get to go to that level of enjoyment again, it's not happy. And you get angry. Look at a couple who's been dating for, say, more than 6 weeks. And they're always angry at each other. They don't get along well in a group. And they isolate themselves. They're unhappy because they're fighting some kind of sexual battle. Because they've been on the ladder and now they're frustrated because they're not on the ladder. Does that make sense? Now, unfortunately, if I'm with this girl and we go to this step on the ladder, the chances of me being able to date her and not go back to that step on the ladder and keep progressing are pretty small. In most cases, I think the best thing to do is break up. Now, the problem is that when you break up, the next person you date, your body's going to say, hey, we go to this step. It's going to be hard to maintain your purity in all relationships. And if you date somebody who's been on a step higher, they're going to try to get you. They won't care to go to this step because that step leads to this step. And so all your sexual experience leads into all your other sexual experiences. And the later you can delay that, the better off you'll be. Because you've got some natural protections built in as a teenager in high school. But when you get off to college, those natural barriers, those natural protections, the curfew of mom and dad, somebody waiting up when you get in aren't there. You go home to a dorm room, you go home to an apartment. There's no rules there. And if you've already been used to this high on the ladder, it's going to be very, very difficult to back down off that ladder. That make sense? Is that too plain? Yes, sir. And we treat anxiety with a similar principle called systematic desensitization. If I can get you to approach something that you're afraid of, the closer I can get you to it, the less afraid you'll be. Well, that's how temptation works. Eve didn't run to the middle of the garden and start picking fruit. She ended up in the middle of the garden looking at a tree she wasn't supposed to be near. If she just stayed out of that part of the garden, she'd ever taken of it. That's the way temptation works, as I get you closer and closer and closer. What we teach the police in the academy is a reactionary gap. And that reactionary gap is how much distance is there between me and you so that I can react. Well, when I train the cadets, if they'll let me get in their reactionary gap, I can take advantage of them. I can trick them. I can defraud them by being that close to them. And a smart person keeps you away from them. And there's real distance and there's artificial distance. And you got to build in those reactionary gaps when it comes to temptation. And you may have to have some hard and set rules. And they'll sound almost like ridiculous rules. But, hey, I can't go into your house. You can't come into my house. I can't go into your house unless your parents are up. And moms and dads, you need to sit up and wait on your kids to come home from dates. And the car comes in the driveway. Hey, my dad's up. He's going to expect me to come in the house in 3 minutes. And just some things to protect you. Now, sex is healthy. Sex is normal, but it's designed for marriage. And the further away you stay away from it before you're married, the less likely you are to get in trouble with multiple different people in your marriage. Other questions or comments? Yes, sir. Yes, they had Cain, Abel, and Seth. They had 3 children. And probably more that we don't know about. But we know for sure they had Cain, Abel, and Seth. Cain killed Abel, and then Seth came along later. But there are 3 that are named in the Bible, Cain, Abel, and Seth. Yes, sir. Oh, yeah. We're at, you know, if you could find Adam's DNA, our DNA connects to it. You'd go, oh wow, that guy came from Adam, because he's the original or the prototype human, first one that God created. And Adam in Hebrew means the man. And so, you know, he had a pretty simple name, the man, the woman. All right. Yeah, I do a lot of my weddings outside, and I go, hey, the first wedding was outside. The first wedding was in a garden, and the first wedding was the only two people were there, and the guy who made people was there. That's the only people at this wedding. But yeah, good questions. Other questions? So some of the best ways to maintain your purity is to have accountability. And that's uncomfortable, and you're not going to like it, but accountability with your dad. Your dad knows something about dating. How do I know this? Well, you're here. He's a successful dater. Okay? I just know that. He got an A in dating because you're here. Your dad knows this stuff. Now, you can't picture your dad being young and cool, but he is young and cool. And the reason he dresses like a nerd is because he spends his money on your clothes. Okay? So just understand that. If it wasn't for your budget, he'd dress nice too. Okay? But so the best source of your accountability is a young man to have some real serious talks with his dad about purity. And you may find out your dad made some mistakes. You find out your dad did some things as a young man he probably regrets. But a smart man learns from the mistakes of his own mistakes. A brilliant man learns from the mistakes of others. And so if you can learn from my wisdom and learn from things that I shouldn't have done, and you don't repeat those, you'll have a much better chance of surviving without a lot of guilt and a lot of hassles. Sex is designed by God. And this verse in the Bible says, where two become one. That's talking about not just on a physical level, but on an emotional level and a psychic level. But when you have sex for the first time with someone, there's a chemical that secretes in your body. I think it's called oxytocin. And it's a bonding hormone. It makes you connected to that person. And that should be a one-time connection. Well, the reason people have trouble breaking up with their first loves is they often get too high on the ladder and they get bonded to somebody that's not permanent. Think about being bonded to somebody you're not going to be permanent with, and then it's hard to leave them alone. It's hard to break away from them, and it haunts you the rest of your life. And it's you don't need to put yourself in that situation. Okay? Now, you got to talk to your dad. Say, okay, Dad, I'm going out with this girl. What are the rules of engagement? Your dad give you some good advice about keeping your purity, while at the same time having the realization that, I've got to know whether or not I like this person. Some people get married and it's a good relationship on paper, but they don't have any chemical connection to each other. They're not really friends. They don't really enjoy each other's company. Well, you can't have an academic arrangement and have a successful marriage. You can, but it's hard. And so you can't ignore both parts of it. If you're not physically attracted to this person and you've got this checklist that, she has red hair and goes to church on Sundays, that's not a way to choose. You got to make sure you're actual friends. Because if you don't have the same worldview, if you don't have the same problem-solving skills, and you don't share a mythos, something that you're passionate about, you're probably incompatible for marriage. But we skip that and we get physical. We go, we got a lot in common because we like to touch each other. Well, that's no way to build a relationship. But at the same time, we do all this stuff, but we never held hands and we never kissed. You don't know. So there's a balance in that is kind of unique to our culture. But ask your dad and ask your mom for some of that guidance. All right? And just because a young lady says it's okay to do this with me doesn't mean it's okay to do. You got to protect her from you and from herself. Okay? Which is super, super, super important. Other questions? It is an uncomfortable topic. If you have a phone or a laptop or an iPad and you've already ventured into the world of looking at things you shouldn't look at, you need to have some accountability. Your dad, one of your best friends, hey, look, here's my iPad. Here's some security codes. I want you to set them. I want you to give a password and don't tell me. Now, if you're not willing to lock yourself out of that, you may not be mature enough to have one of those devices. And it's super, super hard. Because once you get that associated with dopamine, that dopamine thing in your brain says, hey, we need some of this. Hey, we need some of this. Hey, we need some of this. And so the way addiction works, and please understand, I do not think that there's any appropriate circumstance for you as a young man to look at pornography. Okay? I think it's sinful. I think it falls into the line of lust. And I think it falls into the line of defrauding someone. Because this young lady who's posing for those pictures, there's a lot going on in her life that's a dumpster fire, or she'll be posing for those pictures. Okay? So I don't think there's any reason to do. But doing it is often normal and may even be somewhat healthy with your interest. Can I say that and everybody be okay? I'm looking at naked girls because I'm 16 and I'm interested in naked girls. Guess what? You're 16, you're interested in naked girls. If you're between the ages of 13 and 23 and you're average, you have a thought about sex every 7 seconds. That's an average kid. That's not that creepy kid who wants to hug everybody, okay? Get on the bus, you little pervert, okay? Now, that's a normal thing. The problem is I'm a 16-year-old boy and I've got this habit of looking at naked people. If you ever look at naked people, and it's not just because they're naked, but because of boredom, stress, hungry, angry, lonely, or tired, you're now using that as medication, as a mood changer. And that's when it becomes an addiction. So now hey, look, I'm 16. I don't know anything about sex. I don't know anything about naked people. I'm going to look at some pictures. I think it's wrong, but I think it's normal. But once you start using that as medication, as a mood changer, I'm looking at these images, boredom, stress, hungry, angry, lonely, tired. Now it's become an addiction. Because when any activity leaves its normal function to be a mood elevator, you've walked into the realm of you've now dependent on it. Does that make sense? I'm not endorsing any pornography under any circumstances. But in some circumstances, it's something that you can do and stop doing. Once it gets associated with boredom, stress, hungry, angry, lonely, tired, you probably can't stop doing it because it's got its claws in you. Okay? So what happens in addiction, it's not the thing you're addicted to that's the big deal. And there's some really smart men who talk about brain chemistry. And brain chemistry is a teeny tiny, itsy bitsy part of the puzzle. Okay, I'm not taking anything away from guys who are neuroscientists and stuff, but a lot of times your neuroscientists only look at the science part, and they don't look at the human part. Okay? The brain chemistry is not as powerful as the feeling you had when you made the decision to do whatever you do. If you're familiar with Pavlov's dogs, ring a bell and the dogs salivate, ring a bell and you feed them and the dogs salivate, then you can ring the bell without food and the dogs will salivate. We get things connected on the Pavlovian thing. So, let's take it away from porn and let's talk about let's just talk about eating Twinkies. Okay, nothing sinful with eating Twinkies as long as you don't eat all of them, okay? Well, I eat Twinkies because they're good. I eat Twinkies because they won't rot. I eat Twinkies because they'll survive the zombie apocalypse. All right? And so here's a Twinkie. It's been here 47 years. I can still eat it because it won't go bad. That probably tells you things about Twinkies you need to know. All right. But if I start thinking, every time this guy at school picked on me, I felt better when I ate a Twinkie. I've connected this bad feeling with eating a Twinkie. Now, the way my brain works is anything that is similar, my brain will treat as the same because my brain protects me in my environment. That makes sense? If you get stung by a hornet, you'll dodge a housefly. Why? Because your brain generalizes. Black buzzing bad. If you're scared of snakes, you'll kill a short-legged lizard. If you're scared of snakes, you'll chop the water hose. If you got bit by a Doberman, a Jack Russell will make you nervous because your brain watches and that which is similar is the same. So if I've got this habit of using anything, Twinkies, porn, marijuana, because of bored, stressed, hungry, and only tired, every time I have that similar feeling, that's the feeling I had when I made the decision to smoke, drink, look at porn, or whatever. That's how the addiction cycle gets reinforced. Everybody understand that? So what happens is you're rocking along having a good day and you get, I don't like to use the word trigger because triggers sound like you're out of control. I like to use the word reminder. You get a trauma. Something happens And the feeling I have in this moment is similar to the feeling I had when I connected this feeling in marijuana, this feeling in porn, this feeling in shopping, this feeling in gambling. So I have this feeling, and it starts preoccupational thinking. Now, preoccupational thinking means I need my thing, whether it's Twinkies or porn or whatever. But you start thinking about it earlier in the day. And preoccupational thinking becomes an obsession. It becomes a craving. Preoccupational thinking leads to ritualized behavior. Now, what is ritualized behavior? It's the strength of your habit. When you get ready to go to school in the mornings, you have a routine. And you do it and you don't even think about it, right? You end up with, how did I wear this shirt? Well, I just grabbed a shirt and put it on. That's why when you're in the 7th grade, it's terrible because you don't really think about what you wear. I hadn't had hair in 20 years. Okay? It went away and I started shaving my head. I can be getting ready in the mornings and my phone go off and there be something that disrupts my routine. I get in the shower and I'll shampoo my head. And I hadn't had hair in 20 years. Moron, I don't need shampoo up there. Okay? Because the strength of your habits. So when you get into ritualized behavior, preoccupational thinking leads to this ritual. I go to my room. I make sure mom and dad are downstairs. I get my laptop. I get on the private virtual network provider. Whatever it is, you have these intermediate steps that when you do all those steps in that ritual, you're going to do whatever it is you're doing, whether it's looking at porn or smoking weed or whatever. So you get the preoccupational thinking, the ritualized behavior, and then once you're on that ritualized behavior, you're on autopilot. Then you do your compulsive act. It's whatever it is, you go, I said I'd never do this, yet here I am looking on the back end of it. And then you have a period of regret or remorse, which oftentimes is associated with the feelings of boredom, stress, hunger, anger, lonely, tired, preoccupational thinking. And you got this big cycle that keeps repeating itself. Does that make sense? Now, if you can identify any part of that cycle and remove it, you can break your addiction. 12-step programs don't work. Well, they work for 8% of the people. So the idea of AA or NA or NAA or whatever, there's been a lot of stuff in the media that you think, oh, you go to AA. Well, the reality of a 12-step program is relapse. Because what 12-step programs work on is the behavior. The behavior is not the focus. The behavior is the root of the behavior. What are the feelings that I feel when I make the decision to use? And when you understand the circumstance that produced those feelings and you deal with that trauma, you can break the addiction. But that happens on such a subtle realm that we don't really know it. Does that make sense? And so once I say, okay, I'm doing this and it looks like I'm repeating this habit all the time, what is the feeling that I feel when I make the decision to use or do whatever? And when's the first time I ever remember feeling that way? Oh, I've connected this behavior to this circumstance and it repeats itself through life because that's how your brain works to protect you from trauma. That make sense? Lance Dodes, D-O-D-E-S, Lance Dodes, Breaking Addiction. Pretty cool, groundbreaking work. I used his work, and of course he stops at, hey, this is related to trauma. And I combined his work and Courtney Armstrong's work in treating trauma and combined the two for a protocol I use to treat addiction. And it's fairly successful if the person has enough insight about their original precipitating events. That's a lot of stuff to digest. That's some pretty high-level stuff. But any other questions? Questions about addiction? Questions about trauma? Yes? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So once you have the routine, you got to find out what the routine is connected to. The routine is connected with the decision, and the decision to use is almost as powerful as using. Okay. So let's suppose that I change my mood by eating frosted mini Pop-Tarts, which I shouldn't eat because I'm diabetic. Okay. But I think, okay, I'm teaching a lot today. I'm away from home. I'm stressed today. On my way home, I'll make some frosty mini Pop-Tarts. Guess what happened the rest of my day? I can function looking forward to my Frosted Mini Pop-Tarts. Why? Because the decision to use is almost as powerful as using. So once I say I'm going to get a beer, I'm going to smoke some weed, I'm going to look at porn, my day goes to normal because I've made the decision. Well, what was I feeling when I made that decision? If I can deal with the origins of that feeling, that decision never comes up again. So you break any part of the chain doesn't work. You take that clock on the back wall. If I take any part out of that clock, it stops working. It's complicated and it's intricate, but I just pull one part of it, it goes away. It's what we call sophisticatedly simple or sophisticatedly primitive. Your survival mechanisms are sophisticated, but they're also super, super simple. You pull one gear out, the whole thing goes away. So yeah, you break habits by killing one part of the chain. Preoccupation, ritualized behavior, compulsive acting. Typically, you can't stop the compulsion, but you stop the preoccupation or any part of the ritual, and you change that. Did that answer your question? It's a good question. Anybody else? Well, guys, thank you for being patient and mature on a super, super tough topic. I appreciate you guys doing that. Every Man's Battle, pretty decent book to talk about sexual purity. The Emotional Hand Grenade Ladder, pretty good little book. And then the stuff by Lance Dodds on addiction is pretty good stuff too. Thank you, guys.
Hey, guys.